to open this debate. I can't think of a better way to celebrate my 49th birthday.
Surely not.
The coming weeks will be one of the most defining political periods, not just of this Parliament or as our times as MP, but since the Second World War. I know that all honourable and right honourable members will have the national interests at the very forefront of their minds. Next Tuesday, we will be asked if we will support my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. Each one of us will have to make that decision, and it is my belief that the deal on the table is the best option available in ensuring a smooth exit from the European Union. It will ensure that we leave the EU as planned on the 29th of March next year, that we take back control of our borders, end the jurisdiction of the ECJ in the UK, and we stop sending vast sums of money to Brussels. The deal will have a significant impact on two major areas of Home Office policy, that's security and immigration. I very happily take the intervention from the right honourable gentleman.
And he's just mentioned about taking back control and ending the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. I presume he has seen the legal advice published today from the Attorney General, which makes it clear that in fact that is not the case in terms of the backstop, which he also says is indefinite, that Northern Ireland remains in the EU customs union, not in some kind of customs arrangement, and will apply the whole of the EU customs acquis, and the Commission and the European Court of Justice will continue to have jurisdiction over its compliance with those rules. Northern Ireland will treat Great Britain as a third country. How can he possibly stand here and recommend this deal and say that it brings to an end the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice and takes back control?
Mr. Speaker, I very much respect what the right honourable gentleman has just said, and he shared it with the House on a few occasions, and I absolutely understand that. And let me just say from the outset, no one can pretend that this deal is perfect in every sense. There will be some compromises with this deal, with a number of objectives, including, as we just heard just very recently from the Prime Minister herself in Prime Minister's questions, a need to ensure that the commitments in the Good Friday Agreement are upheld. What the right honourable gentleman is referring to, of course, is the if, and it is an if the backstop arrangement kicks in. And he's right to point to the legal advice, but also it is worth keeping in mind that that situation does not necessarily arise. Even if there is no final deal on the future arrangement by December 2020, there's an opportunity for alternative arrangements, including extending the implementation period. And even if then what the right honourable gentleman referred to actually kicked in, the backstop arrangement, it is even legally, from the European Union's perspective, at a minimum, it is not sustainable because it's done under Article 50 of the European Union's own rules. Yes, I will.
Would he not accept that if you're maintaining an open border where there's a land border, that can only be done in a modern economy by having some form of customs union applying to both sides of the border? And unless and until someone else comes forward with an alternative way of timelessly guaranteeing an open border, the arrangement proposed is the only conceivable one that's possible for the foreseeable future until something better comes along. And really, this was quite obvious months ago, and it's quite futile to start protesting about it now.
Mr. Speaker, I always listen carefully to what my right honourable friend has to say on all matters. And I think it is correct that this is one way to ensure in that all-important border completely frictionless trade. But I wouldn't accept it's the only way to do this. And whilst it is recognised in the agreement under the backstop arrangement that this is a way that clearly has been foreseen by this agreement, as I said a moment ago, I think there are potentially other ways that this can be achieved, and it is right that we properly explore all possible alternative arrangements. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Rather than listen to the advice of the Father of the House, would the Secretary of State listen to the advice of the Taoiseach of the Irish Republic, Mr Junkers and Michel Barnier in the EU, and his own government, all of whom have said that in the event of no deal or any other kind of deal, they would not impose a hard border on the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. So quite clearly it must be possible to do this, despite the comments of the Father of the House.
Mr Speaker, what the honourable gentleman highlights that it is important to listen to all voices, and I think again it points to, whilst this is an arrangement, it's right that we look and continue to explore to see whether there are other arrangements as well that can lead to a more permanent and more easily acceptable outcome. So, I will give way one more time, then I do need to make some progress, and I will come back and give way later. Thank you. I will give way.
Secretary, from giving way. The legal advice released this morning makes it clear that the protocol does not provide for a mechanism that is likely to enable the UK lawfully to exit the UK-wide customs union without a subsequent agreement. It goes on to say, this remains the case even if parties are still negotiating many years later, and even if the parties believe that talks have clearly broken down and there is no prospect of a future relationship agreement. Doesn't that undermine the point he made a moment ago when he argued that this arrangement was not sustainable in the long term because of the limitations of Article 50? The advice of the Attorney-General is it's going to last.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments, and no doubt he's had some time to digest the legal opinion, but he might also note, I think it's perfectly consistent also with what the Attorney-General said at this dispatch box earlier this week, and the Attorney-General made it clear then what naturally he is providing is a legal analysis, but this should also be seen in the context of the politics of such a situation, and the Attorney-General set out that quite clearly as well on the day, and I refer him to the remarks the Attorney-General had made on that earlier this week. I will give way one more time to my right honourable friend.
Very grateful to the Home Secretary. Will he confirm that the withdrawal agreement means that the UK will have to pay a lot of money for many years after we have left the European Union if we sign it, that there are no cash limits or numbers in the document, very general heads, and that the EU would have preponderant power in deciding just how vast this open-ended commitment will be, which will be massively more than £39 billion?
What I'll say to my right honourable friend is that in the withdrawal agreement, there is an estimated amount that the UK will pay. It won't be instant, it is over a number of years, but there is an estimated amount, and the general number that has been talked of by government ministers and others is a total of £39 billion. Mr. Deputy, I will come back to the honourable lady in a moment. I will do that. Mr. Speaker, the Home Office is affected in two significant areas in terms of this deal, and that's security and immigration. So today I would like to set out what it is that is on offer in these two important areas and why I think it is in the interest of the United Kingdom. So let me first start with security. The Brexit deal negotiated by the Prime Minister delivers the solid foundation we need for future security cooperation with our European partners. It avoids a cliff edge by providing for an implementation period, ensuring a smooth transition from current arrangements to a new, strong partnership. An unplanned no-deal Brexit would mean an immediate and probably indefinite loss of some security capability, which, despite our best efforts, would likely cause some operational disruption when we leave. And as I will in a moment, and as Home Secretary, I know which option I would prefer. I've seen firsthand how important it is to have a strong security partnership with our European allies, and I've seen the potential dangers that kind of cooperation prevents and the security and the safety that it ensures. I will give way.
What he says about no deal is right, but the Chancellor has earned some respect for showing a level of candour this week that there is an economic trade-off with any form of Brexit. Will he be similarly open with the House and the public that there is going to be some form of security trade-off over Brexit to achieve the aims that the Brexiteers want?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, I would point him first to an analysis that we published in quite some detail just last week, an assessment of security arrangements that are in this deal. And whilst I accept that the security arrangements with this deal will be different, inevitably they will be different. Of course, will be a third country outside the EU. What we have here, I think we can safely say, is the most comprehensive security agreement the EU has with any third country. I'll give way.
The former Home Office Minister.
Some time in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee recently on the subject of database access. Yesterday, the Prime Minister was questioned by a fellow member of the Home Affairs Select Committee from Cardiff South and Penarth on the question of whether SIS2 is included in the agreement. The Prime Minister stated that they were referred to in the political agreement. In Section 86 of the political agreement, it only refers to PNR and PRUM, not SIS2, a vital database. Can he now put the House straight as to exactly what the situation is with those databases?
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I will very happily do that. What the agreement refers to, I don't have the exact paragraph in front of me, but in terms of the SIS2 database is a wanted and missing persons database. And there's also another database the agreement refers to in a similar vein, which is a database on criminal records, European criminal records. And the agreement says that we will consider cooperation on those databases, but it does not guarantee it. I will.
Secretary for giving way. Could he point me to the pages in this document that he has published which give guarantees on our membership of Europol, on our membership of Eurojust, and our continued membership of the European Arrest Warrant? Because as a former Home Office Minister, as I am, I can tell him they are critical to the safety of our citizens, and they are absent from this document.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman, and in the agreement it clearly refers to mutual exchange of data, both on passenger names and records, on DNA, on fingerprints, on vehicle registrations, on fast track for extradition, something I'll cover in a moment in my speech, and also continued cooperation with Europol and with Eurojust. I must make some progress. I will give way to the right honourable lady.
I'm grateful to the Home Secretary for giving way. I just wanted to clarify his answer, because as I cannot find anywhere in the political declaration any reference to SIS2. Can he confirm there is no reference to SIS2 anywhere in this document? I'm very happy to give him my copy if he doesn't have a copy with him. And in paragraph 86, as the honourable member for who's also on the Select Committee referred to, only refers to passenger name, record and the PRUM databases. It does not refer to SIS2. Can he clarify for the House there is no reference to SIS2 in the declaration?
Well, I thank the right honourable lady for her question, and also the focus she's brought to this in the Select Committee as well, including recently. Just to be clear, there's no claim that the document itself refers to the databases SIS2 or the ECRIS database, for that matter. What the document talks about is considering continued cooperation on the kind of information that is in those databases, and it will be properly considered to see if there's a way to continue that type of cooperation. I will give way to her one more time. She's the chair of the Select Committee.
I am grateful for him to doing so, because that paragraph 87 refers to considering further arrangements and arrangements that might approximate those enabled by relevant union mechanisms. Well, the SIS2 database has 76 million pieces of information on it. There's no sign that anybody's going to create another alternative database that has just as much information on it. So what on earth does it mean to talk about approximating access to the SIS2 database? Either we get access to it or we don't.
Absolutely.
Well, what I would say to the right honourable lady is what it means is exactly what it says in paragraph 87, which is that we will consider further arrangements that will help the exchange of information on wanted or missing persons and criminal records. And the right honourable lady will be more aware than most people in this House, given her interest in these matters, that we didn't join this database until 2015 was the first time we joined this database. Before that, we were using other databases on wanted and missing persons, including the Interpol database. So there are also other pieces of data that we can use for this type of information. But I think it's good that we've got an outcome here that we will consider further cooperation on exactly this kind of important information. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way for all the concern that's being expressed by colleagues on both sides of the House. Is the Home Secretary aware of a single Interior Minister or Security Agency Chief around the whole of the EU that actually wants to reduce the level of cooperation that the UK currently has with the EU and the countries within?
It's a very good intervention my honourable friend makes. In all my discussions with Interior Ministers on security cooperation, there is not a single one I have come across that wants to reduce security cooperation, and every single one understands the mutual benefit that comes about through continued cooperation and information exchange. Now, Mr. Speaker, the deal the UK has reached with the EU will provide for the broadest and the most comprehensive security relationship the EU has ever had with another country. This agreement allows for our relationship to include various important areas of cooperation, continuing the work closely together on law enforcement and criminal justice, keeping people safe in the UK, across Europe and around the world through exchanging information on criminals and tackling terrorism, ensuring that we can investigate and prosecute those suspected of serious crime and terrorism, supporting international efforts to prevent money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, combating new and evolving threats such as cyber security. It also allows us for joint working on wider security issues, including asylum and illegal migration. The declaration also sets out that we should carry on sharing significant data and processes such as, I will in a moment, such as passenger name records, so that we can continue disrupting criminal networks involved in terrorism, serious crime and modern slavery, on DNA, fingerprint and vehicle registration data, ensuring law enforcement agencies can quickly investigate and prosecute criminals and terrorists. Fast-track extradition to bring criminals to justice quickly where they've committed a crime, and as well as continued cooperation with Europol and Eurojust. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Wish list, and it's all in the political declaration, but it's no more deliverable than a letter to Santa Claus. It really isn't, because there's no settled policy on extradition, there's no settled policy in a legal definition that could be delivered through the law courts on any of these elements, and the proof of this is that the government hasn't even got an immigration policy. It's all very well having a wish list, but how on earth could a serious Member of Parliament vote for nothing more than a wish list?
Well, when it comes to leaving the EU, Mr. Speaker, the only wish list I'm aware of that's worth nothing are Labour's so-called six principles. That's the wish list that the honourable gentleman has continually supported and supported again and again. But when it comes to this actual deal, and especially on security cooperation, for example, there is an agreement on mutual exchange of data on passenger name records, on DNA, on fingerprints, on vehicle registrations and on fast-track extradition. He should go and explain to his constituents how important that is to them. I will give way to the honourable lady.
Secretary, can he confirm that if we are out of the European arrest warrant and unable to put any other identical arrangement in place, there are a number of countries that will be unable in future under their own constitution to extradite their nationals to this country?
I can say, first to the Honourable Lady, that we're not going to have an identical way for extradition in the future, because there's no need for an identical way. We will be outside the European Union, no longer a member, so it is not appropriate that we are members of the current exact mechanism, the European arrest warrant, but that doesn't mean that we can't continue to cooperate with an agreement with the EU on fast and expeditious extradition procedures and fast-track extradition, and it's in the agreement. It's been agreed. No, I will not. I do have to make some progress. Now, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to external threats, we will be able to have an ambitious partnership also on foreign policy, security and defence, which will enable both sides to combine efforts for the greatest impact. And it allows for ongoing cooperation on other important cross-cutting issues, including countering violent extremism and the spread of infectious diseases. Of course, there is some further work to be done to ensure that we build on the foundation that this deal provides. This is not about wanting to stay close to the EU and its security arrangements just for the sake of it. We are leaving, and our relationship must change. This is about a hard-headed, pragmatic, evidence-based decision on what is the best security interest of the UK. I will give way.
Secretary confirm that because we won't be participating in the PESCO arrangements, that we will have no seat in the room, no voice and no vote or veto within any of the foreign policy, defence and security arrangements. We won't be in the European Defence Agency, and we won't be unless we have a special arrangement with the European Defence Fund. What is the point of that in terms of increasing our security?
Mr. Speaker, what I'd say gently to the honourable gentleman, of course, when we've left the EU, we won't be participating as direct members in those kinds of foreign and security tools. We will have our own independent foreign and defence policy, and we will have the ability, if we choose to align ourselves with the EU. And the honourable gentleman should also remember, because it is worth recalling in this House, that our security is underpinned across Europe through our membership of NATO, not membership of the European Union. Now, when it comes to security, Mr. Speaker, ultimately I believe that this deal strikes the right balance, and we will keep Britain one of the safest countries in the world. I would also like to turn now to the consequences for security of no deal. An uncooperative no deal would have an impact on protecting the public. There will be no implementation period smoothing our transition into these new arrangements. The UK would have to stop using EU security tools and data platforms from March next year. There will be unhelpful implications for our law enforcement agencies and border guards. There would be disruption, and they would have less information available to do their jobs, including identifying and arresting people who could threaten the security of some of our citizens. They would have fewer options for pursuing criminals across borders, as we would lose the ability to pool our efforts through Europol and Eurojust. And it would take longer to track, arrest and to bring to justice those who commit crimes internationally. I've established, I will in a moment, Mr. Speaker, I've established and I chair a weekly Cobra-style planning meeting within the Home Office to plan for this properly in case this eventuality comes about. But no matter how effectively we prepare for a no deal, setting aside the capabilities we have developed with the EU, with our EU partners, will of course have some consequences. I will give way.
Secretary is getting on with his speech, but I've been listening very intently. He hasn't really given me the assurance I want on Europol. And can I give him a last chance in his speech just to mention Galileo?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman says he's been listening very carefully. I do doubt it, because I think I have given him and honourable members assurance about the security implications of this deal, what security situation may look like if there's a no deal. But it is clear to me, we are lucky to live in one of the safest countries in the world, and with this deal we will continue to be one of the safest countries. And of course, even if there is no deal, there are some mitigants. There's no perfect mitigant at all. We will lose certain tools that we certainly would have been helpful from a security perspective, but whatever happens, Britain will continue to be one of the safest countries in the world. I will give way to...
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Is he aware that one of the problems with the withdrawal agreement, whatever he has said, is that state aid provisions would prevent the government from subsidising or supporting our defence industries in the same way as the EU can and as we currently can under the EU treaties? And is that not a serious risk to our national security, which the government has failed to take into account?
Mr. Speaker, I've listened to my honourable friend carefully. I have yet to see so far in terms of course, there's those EU state aid rules applied to the UK at the moment, and they will indeed through the implementation period. I've yet to see how that has a detrimental impact on our security apparatus and supply, but given that my honourable friend has raised this question, it is worth looking at more closely. If he allows me, I will do so and get back to him. And I will.
Isn't he giving us a completely false choice by saying it's either this deal or no deal, particularly in the decision that we made, regarding the decision we made yesterday in this House, that clearly allows us as a House to choose different options than just this deal or no deal? Isn't this a false choice that he's giving us?
No, Mr. Speaker, it's not. And, Mr. Speaker, I would now like to turn to the other big issue for the Home Office regarding this deal, which is immigration. Now, concerns over immigration were a key factor in how people voted in the referendum in 2016. People wanted control over immigration. They wanted future decisions on UK immigration policy to be taken in this country and by this Parliament. That is what this... I will in a moment. That is what this deal delivers. The deal will allow us to create an immigration system that is not constrained by EU laws and which works only in the national interest. Free movement will end. In future, the decision on who comes to the UK will rest with the UK itself and not with individual migrants. The UK will continue to be an open and welcoming country that attracts the best talent from across the world. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful to him for giving way. Can I just impress upon him again the acute problems that there have been in fishing on the west coast of Scotland and indeed in Northern Ireland? And I don't know how many numerous meetings I've had with various government ministers. They come and they go over the time. But would he look next year to make sure that this doesn't happen again? That we're making sure we're getting crews on boats and we make sure that non-EE labour are coming in. The problem is going to get worse with the situation we have at the moment. The Home Secretary has it in his gift. It's not Europe that's stopping him, it's in his gift. He can lift the pen. This will happen. He will be thanked and appreciated across the west coast of Scotland if he does that.
Mr. Speaker, I'm always very happy to listen to honourable members, and indeed I've met many of the Conservative Scottish members of this House who have made that point in a very powerful way, and so we are listening. I think if I think it can be fairly said what the honourable gentleman is referring to is issues believes he has currently here and now, whereas I do want to focus for this debate on the future immigration system. I will give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Home Secretary for giving way, and he is absolutely right to say that concerns about immigration were at the forefront of many of the reasons people cited for voting to leave. Therefore, is it not extraordinary that ultimately we do not know what the immigration policy and stance of this country would be after March? It necessarily will be interrelated with a future economic relationship. We have no certainty on that. We do not know what it will be. And he has not published his immigration bill. So how does anyone know before this vote what they will be getting on immigration in this withdrawal agreement, ultimately?
Well, where I agree with the honourable gentleman is that first, I think we agree that immigration was a big issue in the referendum debate. Second, that what type of immigration system we have in the future, of course, will have an impact on our economic performance. But I have, in terms of what that system might look like, and I know he will be listening carefully to the rest of this debate, that I'll give more information on what that might look like. That we are setting out the sort of broad principles of the new system, and we will be publishing a white paper which will have much more. We will be publishing a white paper soon. Yes, we will publish soon. And I know, I will in a moment. Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable members are opposite, in particular, are very eager for this white paper. They don't have to wait long. And when that it's also worth keeping in mind that when that white paper is published, that is not the end of the conversation. Like all white papers, it is essentially the start of a broad consultation that will last for many weeks, where we'll be able to speak to many businesses and others, and honourable and right honourable members, and that will be a moment where we can set out much more detail. I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable friend. Speaking as a Brexiteer, somebody who campaigned for Brexit, can I say that the most important determinant was sovereignty, sovereignty of this place. And as part of that, clearly sovereignty to decide our own immigration, control our borders, etc. Can he give an indication that the future immigration policy, because we're not against immigration, we want controlled immigration, can he assure us that it will be non-discriminatory as far as the world is concerned?
I can absolutely give my honourable friend that assurance, and I absolutely agree with all the points that he's just made there, including the importance of control of our immigration policy. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
He and I both served in the cabinet of the previous Prime Minister, and he will recall that he tried with the European Union to get a limitation on the access to welfare payments for those who've just arrived here. He did that without success. Now we have left and we say we want to take back control. It's very vague in the political declaration. It talks about social security cooperation. Could he now tell me, is it our ambition to ensure that businesses can't bring people over, pay them very cheap wages, expect them then to claim benefits, and they then live in squalid conditions? Will we now rule out access to many of those benefits which cost a lot of money for people who come over from the EU?
Mr. Speaker, I agree very much with the sentiment of what my right honourable friend has said, and I think that it is fair to say that once we have left the EU, we have a lot more flexibility in that area, and the rules that we will apply, turning back to the question just a moment before as well, they will be non-discriminatory. We will apply the broad intention to apply the same rules to anyone regardless of their nationality. We'll be focused on an individual's skills, what they have to offer, the contribution that they have to make, and we will not want welfare or any other type of social security payment to be part of a decision about whether someone wishes to come and work in this country. And when the white paper is set out, there will be more detail on this. I will give way to the right honourable lady, and then I'll come there. Thank you.
Thank the Home Secretary, and also put in a word for the other member of the Select Committee as well, who is hoping to catch your eye as well. The Home Secretary also told us just 8 days ago that the Immigration White Paper would certainly be published in December. Can he tell us, is that still true?
I can tell the honourable lady that it is certainly still my intention to publish it in December, and that hasn't changed. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Home Secretary for giving way, because what the Home Secretary said at the Home Affairs Select Committee was, and I quote, "The meaningful vote is on the 11th. I hope the White Paper on immigration, will come before that." That was just last week. Yet on Monday he said on the radio it was unlikely, actually very unlikely, to be published before the vote. What happened in those 4 or 5 days to change the Home Secretary's mind? And does he think it's acceptable that this House should vote on the withdrawal deal without the information in the White Paper?
I'd say two things to my honourable friend, and it's a very fair point that he raises. I mean, the first is that he asks what's happened, and it's just worth reminding him and the House that this is the most significant change in our immigration system in 45 years. And rather than rush the white paper, it is important that we focus on the detail and we get it right and we get it out as soon as possible. And the second point I'd make is that this white paper, of course, we should think of our new immigration system as part of our deal as we exit from the European Union. But it is also clear that if we have no deal, there will also still be a new immigration system. And it is worth, I think, for honourable members to keep that in mind too. I will give way to the honourable lady who's been very patient. Thank you.
Grateful to the Home Secretary for giving way. I just want to disturb the slightly cosy consensus that was rising there between the Labour front bench and some between the government front bench and some on the Labour backbenches, because of course the view on immigration in Scotland is different. Voters in Scotland don't want to reduce immigration. Business, the universities, the financial sector, the fintech sector, the cyber security sector in my constituency are very keen not to reduce migration into Scotland. Is he aware of that, and will he take that on board in his white paper?
Well, I think, therefore, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady will agree with what I have to say next, which is that immigration has been good for Britain. It has made us a good hub for culture, for business, for travel, and it's boosted our economy and our society in countless ways, and that's as true for Scotland as it is for other parts of the United Kingdom. And that's why, from the very start of this process, for example, this government's first priority, my first priority, has been to safeguard the position of the more than 3 million EU citizens that are currently living in the UK, and the almost 1 million UK nationals living in the EU. I will come back in a moment. The withdrawal agreement guarantees the rights of EU citizens and their family members living in the UK and the UK nationals living in the EU. And my message on this has been very clear. EU citizens make a huge contribution to our economy and to our way of life. They are our friends, they are our colleagues, they are our neighbours, and we need and we want them to stay, regardless of whether there is a deal or there is no deal. And so, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that even in the event of no deal, EU citizens and their families living here in the UK before we leave will be able to apply to the EU settlement scheme and stay. And we will be setting more details on this out shortly. I will give way.
One of the other things that the Home Secretary will think about is it's not necessarily a win for British citizens to lose the right to travel, study and work elsewhere in the European Union. It's been something that has been vital to a whole generation of people in this country. But more importantly, he says he's going to change the system for the immigration system. Is he still going to try and stick to this ludicrous proposal of getting net migration down to the tens of thousands? Because even in the category where the government has been fully in control, which is in migration from other parts of the world outside the EU, that runs at more than 200,000 a year now. Will he please say now they're going to get rid of this nonsense?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman mentioned students. Yeah, I welcome student exchange, and I want to see more students, whether they're from the EU or outside the EU, choosing Britain as the place to study. And we have been very clear that when it comes to students, for example, there is no cap on student numbers. We've seen actually in the last year, we've seen a significant increase in student numbers from across the world, and that is just the type of country we want to remain, where we're welcoming people, especially students and others from across the world, those that either want to study here, they want to come here as tourists, or they have skills to contribute that we actually need. I will give way to the honourable lady.
Giving way. Of course, we don't just want the students to come here. We want them, particularly in Scotland, to stay here to contribute to our economy. And will the Home Secretary look at reinstating the post-study work visa so that we're not educating young people from across the world simply to take the skills elsewhere and to feed other countries' economies?
I have some sympathy with what the honourable lady said, and interestingly, in a report that I'll mention in a moment, the Independent MAC report, it did talk about looking at some of the post-study work rights, and I am doing that. We've got to be careful, though, that that those post-study work rights don't in themselves become the reason for someone to choose to study in Britain. They must choose to study in Britain because of what our fantastic universities and other education establishments have to offer. But I think it is also sensible that when people are choosing to study in Britain, and if they are taking qualifications that are needed in our own economy, that we have a sensible approach that allows them to stay, if it makes sense for us, and to continue to contribute. I will give way to one lady. Yep.
Understand what the Home Secretary was saying there about post-study work visas. Is he saying that we shouldn't deliberately try to attract talent to the nations of these islands? Is that his position? That we shouldn't deliberately try to attract talent to the nations of these islands? Is that the government's position?
I think, Mr. Speaker, I can say that's the complete opposite of what I was saying. So either the lady misheard me, or that is what she would like me to say, so she can open it up in some kind of press release as some kind of attack line. That is exactly what I didn't say. I'm happy to make it clear that I welcome students that choose Britain. And I think that we should take a fresh look at how we can retain talent that has chosen Britain to study to continue to work in Britain if it meets our economic needs. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
More broadly of universities, obviously they rely on attracting the best academic talent to teach our students and international students. Can he just briefly set out whether his immigration paper will make sure it doesn't close doors to that, and reflecting on the fact that many of these professionals will not be highly paid, and often it's salaries that are taken to translate to skill levels, and in that case, and also in the case of performing arts, that does not hold.
Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend speaks with a great deal of experience in this area, and she's absolutely right to point that out. They are our universities do rely on academic talent, and much of that comes from abroad, and that is to be welcomed. And we must have an immigration system that continues to do that, and we must take a careful look at the salary levels, as she's just talked of. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Further to my right honourable friend's point, will the Home Secretary commit to looking at the extra costs that will also fall and the bureaucracy that will fall to our health service and our care sector? And as my right honourable friend has said, because of the salary threshold that applies, so many of the really key staff that allow our health service and care sector to function will fall below that salary threshold, and the extra costs that will fall on the care sector in particular are quite extraordinary. Will he commit to reducing the bureaucracy and tackling that cost?
Mr. Speaker, it's again a very important point that's been raised by my colleagues, and I can absolutely make that commitment. She's quite right to raise it, because we have to recognise when you move from the current system of freedom of movement, where there is virtually no bureaucracy to speak of, to a system that we will require visas for every worker, that we've got to keep an eye on that, any of the paperwork and bureaucratic requirements, and to keep it as simple and as light touch as possible, not just for larger employers such as hospitals, for example, NHS trusts, but also, in my mind, are the smaller employers that may be looking for skills, but maybe just one or two people a year, and to keep that in our minds as well. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Very grateful to the Home Secretary for giving away. It's not just, of course, doctors and nurses. In my constituency, an awful lot of those involved in agriculture and tourism are concerned to ensure that a seasonal workforce continues to be readily available. So can the Home Secretary reassure that in his plans is a mechanism for allowing that sort of migration, so that the needs of those very important industries in Somerset can be met?
Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and he will know that already I have announced a pilot for seasonal workers agricultural scheme, which we were starting early next year. And the purpose of that pilot, working with my right honourable friend, the DEFRA Secretary, is to make sure that we look carefully at how we can continue to meet the needs of that very important sector. I will give way one more time at this point to right honourable gentleman.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way. I'm sure the Home Secretary realises that there's 800,000 people in this country actually work in the automobile industry, and therefore it's very important we get the specialist labour that facilitates research and development, and that involves the universities, and not very much has been said in relation to Brexit about the plight of the universities if it's not handled properly.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is quite right to highlight the importance of our automobile industry and the need for skills, particularly in areas such as engineering. And I can give an assurance that we will want to make sure that the new immigration system allows for these vital skills where they are needed. I will just give way one more time at this point to the honourable gentleman.
Will you confirm that in the case of a no deal, there will be an immediate hard border in Northern Ireland to stop the passage of people and products, and in the event of a deal, then people will just be able to fly into Dublin and walk into the UK via Northern Ireland?
Mr. Speaker, what I can confirm that no one wants a no deal, but in the event of a no deal, the UK government would not do anything to create a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Mr. Speaker, it is unrestricted immigration that has caused some people some concerns. It will shortly, as I said earlier, I will shortly be bringing forward a white paper which will set out the proposals for the future immigration system. I do understand the frustrations of honourable members about the timing of this white paper, but I say again, it is an entirely new system, the most significant change to our immigration rules in 45 years, and we need to take the time to get the details right. We have been clear that it will be a system that is based on skills, not on a person's nationality. The design of the future system has to be based on evidence and the needs of our economy. This is why we commissioned the Independent Migration Advisory Committee to report on the economic impact of EU workers and to ensure that the new system, benefits Britain. In addition to this, we have been listening and engaging with businesses up and down the country to hear their views, their concerns and their ideas. And I'm grateful to all those who have taken the trouble to give us their views and who have submitted evidence to the MAC. We have considered that advice, and we will be setting it out, taking that into account when we publish our white paper. Our future system will be flexible so that the trade deals we agree with the EU and with others can allow businesses to provide services and move existing staff between offices and different countries, supporting our dynamic economy. And the agreement we have reached with the EU will enable us to do this through visa-free travel for tourists and business travellers, arrangements for service providers and for researchers and for students. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank him for giving way. He's been very generous. He has actually not answered the question previously from the Honourable Member of Rhondda, whether it isn't time that we stop demonising immigration, and I'll come clean with the fact that immigration is actually dictated by the job market and not by wishful thinking about how much immigration we actually like. And in fact, the figures that came out that demonstrated that EU immigration is down, but outside EU immigration is up, clearly demonstrate that point. We need immigration.
Absolutely. Well put.
Mr. Speaker, I do feel that I've been very clear on that point. I've just said a moment ago, for instance, that immigration is good for our country and we need a system that welcomes people and the talent that we all want to see in this country that will help this country, but particularly our economy and our needs. I'll give way.
How does the Home Secretary feel that the immigration section of the Home Office is going to cope in the new regime when it can't even run an effective, efficient, fair immigration service at the moment that is already damaging British reputation overseas from non-EU countries?
Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that the Home Office can cope with a big change in our immigration approach. That's not to say that there aren't lessons to learn from mistakes that have been made in the past, but the important thing is to make sure when things do go wrong, which they do, and that happens in any large organisation, and it's happened under successive governments, that when that happens, that you have an independent analysis and you draw the proper lessons, and that's exactly what we are doing in the Home Office. And I'm confident with that and with the talent we have in the Home Office, we can deliver this new immigration system. Now, Mr. Speaker, our immigration system must be one that is tailored towards supporting and giving preferential treatment to highly skilled workers. And of course, there are sectors and businesses which have come to rely on low-skilled workers and continued access to migrant labour, and I do understand that. But in controlling migration, we should always look to those in our own workforce first. We will need to work with businesses so that they can adapt and play their part in increasing the skills of British people. We are also committed to ensuring that our world-class education sector can continue to grow and prosper with no limit on the number of international students who come here to study. I'll give way.
Giving way, and on the point of work, will he lift the ban on asylum seekers having the right to work?
Mr. Speaker, we currently have no plans to change that arrangement, but it is one of the areas that I would like to review. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. The White Paper is intended to be the start of a new conversation on immigration. It is not the last word, but the start of an ongoing dialogue with employers, with businesses, and with others who use our immigration system. The Home Affairs Select Committee has said that we should aim for greater consensus on immigration, and I agree. Basing our policy on evidence and extensive discussion with those affected will help us achieve this. Mr. Speaker, we plan to introduce a new immigration system and these new immigration rules from 2021 after the end of the implementation period. For the first time in over 45 years, the UK will have complete control over its own immigration arrangements, and we will ensure that we have a system that ends free movement, that is fair and fast, and that works in the interest of all parts of the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by reminding honourable and right honourable members that the British people were given a choice and told that their choice would be honoured. This deal involves taking back control of our money, our borders, our laws, whilst also protecting jobs, security and our precious union. For the first time in a generation, we will be able to build an immigration system that is designed in Britain, made in Britain and serves only our national interests. The deal protects not only EU citizens living in the UK, but UK nationals living in the EU. And it also upholds the first duty of any government, keeping our citizens as safe as possible. I urge honourable members to join me in supporting this.
The question is, as on the order paper, as Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in many ways, migration and security are at the heart of this debate around Brexit. So I am glad to have the opportunity to contribute from my front bench. But I think, after the events of yesterday evening, there can be little doubt that this is indeed a botched Brexit. And ministers should be ashamed that they had to be forced to comply with a motion of this House. We heard a lot when they were trying to argue that they shouldn't have to comply about the national interest. But we've read the legal advice. There is nothing in it that compromises the national interest. Embarrassing for the government, maybe, but not compromising the national interest. And as the member for Stone in Staffordshire pointed out, it isn't actually the full legal advice, and it may be he wants to return to that matter. I voted to remain, and the Labour Party campaigned to remain and reform. But my party has said from the beginning that we respect the referendum result. And it is true that there were substantive reasons to vote for Brexit. Above all, there were the long-standing concerns about sovereignty, so well articulated over his entire lifetime by my late colleague, the member for Chesterfield, Tony Benn. But nobody would deny that concerns about migration were not far from the minds of some, if not all, Leave voters. The available...
Grateful to the honourable lady for giving way. Does the Labour Party support the continuation of free movement of people? Yes or no?
You will know that when we leave the single market, freedom of movement falls. We said that in our manifesto, and we are saying it now. The available research confirms the salience of migration to Leave voters. In June 2017, a report collected in the British Social Attitude Survey revealed the most significant factor in the Leave vote was anxiety about the number of people coming to the UK. A comprehensive study published by the Nuffield College drew similar conclusions. And who can forget?
But wouldn't she agree that what in fact has happened is that since 2010 the Conservatives have made the poor poorer and then told them the reason they're poor is because of foreigners, and that's why they voted for Brexit? Well, in fact, migration helps us, and the issue isn't about allowing that right-wing propaganda to lead our country, but to stay in the EU and have a public vote on the deal.
I would like to thank my friend for his intervention. All I can say is the Labour Party, whether in opposition or in government, will never scapegoat migrants. We think it doesn't help the society and it's not a constructive way to go forward politically. And who can forget Nigel Farage? Who can forget Nigel Farage in the referendum campaign posing in front of the poster which showed floods of brown people surging into this country?
I'm very grateful for her for giving way. She mentioned a moment ago that one of the main reasons people voted to leave was a concern about sovereignty, and she referred to the views of the late and very well-respected member for Chesterfield. But can I just ask her to speculate on this? Why is it that the Irish, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Danes, I could go on, do not share the same concerns that the English, not the Scots, that the English do about sovereignty in the European Union? Would you care to answer that question? Because it's a question that genuinely puzzles me.
I think the French do.
I don't think it's entirely true to say those countries don't share those concerns. And I think you would have to look to our very different national stories to understand that concern. So migration is at the heart of this Brexit debate, and I'm glad to the opportunity to address it in these remarks this afternoon. But before I turn to immigration, I want to speak about the other theme to today's debate, security. Government ministers have been trying to drum up support for Theresa May's deal by saying that the alternative is no deal, which would be disastrous for security. But Theresa May's deal would be almost as bad. At best, you can say that it is a blindfold Brexit on security. At worst, it may be Theresa May's deal would be almost... the Prime Minister's deal would be almost as bad. At best, you can say it is a blindfold Brexit on security, but at worst, it may be leading us off a cliff on security matters. Ministers insist that the deal that is being put before this House will offer us better arrangements than any other third country. I put it to ministers, that is not the point. The point is not, are they better arrangements than other third countries? The point is, will they give us the same assurances on security and fighting crime that we currently have? And I think if you go through this deal, you will see that there would appear to be a trade-off between security and the government's deal. This is because, in order to achieve a seamless transition on a range of security, policing and justice matters, and to have the current level of cooperation, it would require a new security treaty between the UK and the EU. Yet there is no expressed aim to move towards a security treaty in the exit documents. And ministers cannot say they're unaware of the need for a new security treaty. In Brussels, those stakeholders and commissioners concerned about these matters have been talking for 2 years about the importance of moving forward with a security treaty. And without a security treaty, the result may be that we run the risk of losing a number of tools vital to cross-border security, policing and justice, while other tools will now be hampered or even severely compromised.
She seems to be putting all the blame for this on the United Kingdom. Is she not aware that Rob Wainwright, the former British head of Europol, very distinguished head of Europol, when he appeared in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee, said all the current arrangements, all the current data sharing from which we benefit and our European allies benefit could be continued, and that's what their security forces want. It isn't being purely because of politics.
Could be continued. My point is there's nothing definite in the deal that we are being presented with in this House that would make sure it was continued. On the question of security, assertions, aspirations, a wish list is not enough. We need a treaty. The EU...
Last year, 183 people were returned from other European countries to this country to face justice under the European arrest warrant. Does she share my concern? But as things stand, that process will end.
I absolutely share that concern. The EU insists...
A critical point my honourable friend needs to be aware of is that the European arrest warrant is subject to the ECJ for other European countries, and the government has specifically said we should not be members of the ECJ, so we will have to have individual relationships with each country, therefore making us less safe than the government's proposal to date.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm actually going to come to that point, but I would say here that the Prime Minister's red lines, one of which was the ECJ, may well prove to have been reckless. The EU insists on treaty arrangements governing key aspects of international security, justice and policing, as do we. Without a treaty, courts have no legal basis to implement arrest or extradition warrants. And without a treaty, they cannot allow access to criminal and other databases to third countries. And we are on course to become a third country in our relationship to the EU. Because there is no security treaty planned or even aimed for in the exit documents, the level of cooperation between the UK and EU post-Brexit could be severely and unavoidably downgraded. Ministers will be aware that neither France or Germany will automatically extradite to non-EU countries. And there will be, their constitutions say this, and there will be a mutual loss of the use of the European arrest warrant, and the UK will no longer be able to access the Europol database in real time. In addition, as a third country, the UK's access to databases of criminal records, fingerprints, DNA and missing and wanted persons will be compromised. Ministers promise a future security partnership between this country and the EU. However, the assurance on access to SIS2 is only, and ECRIS, is only that the EU and UK, and I'm quoting, have agreed to consider further how to deliver capabilities that are as far technically as legally possible approximate to those enabled by EU mechanisms. That is not the same of assuring us of the same level of cooperation we have today. And in relation to the European arrest warrant, there's not even that promise. On the passenger name records, exchange of DNA, fingerprints, vehicle registration, the agreement says, and I quote, the UK and the EU have agreed to establish reciprocal arrangements to exchange this type of data. You don't say that you have established reciprocal arrangements, it is a wish for the future. But without appeal and oversight by a court, which role is currently played by the ECJ, all of these could be subject to legal challenge in practice. I need to make progress. In addition, on the EU agencies Europol and Eurojust, which members have intervened on earlier, what the deal says, the UK and the EU have agreed, as part of the FSP, to work together to identify the terms for the UK's cooperation via Europol and Eurojust. Working together to identify the terms is not the same as a guarantee of the same access and cooperation we have today. And as these are EU agencies, they are not, in principle, open to non-member states. Again, if that were to change, the legal basis for such a change would require a treaty. The practical events... I need to make progress. The practical effects are severe. Last year, UK law enforcement agencies accessed SIS2 checks 500 million times. UK authorities requested access to criminal records 3,000 times a week. The danger is that extradition arrangements would fall back on the 1957 European Extradition Convention, which proved extremely time-consuming and cumbersome. Most members of the Council of Europe have reserved rights or derogations under the Convention, limiting its effect. At the worst, the gaps and loopholes created under this exit agreement could create a situation in which organised criminals and terrorists in the EU might come to regard the UK as a relative safe haven from justice. Under this agreement, absent any significant change to the issues enumerated above, ordering cooperation in cases and investigations may ultimately be compromised. On the basis of security concerns alone, no member of this House should be signing off this deal.
I mean, she gives a very accurate list of consequences that follow from leaving the European Union, which is why my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, deftly avoided the question, is it not inevitable that the arrangements in this country for security and the fighting against international crime will be weaker once we've left the European Union than when we were in it? Now, as she also has committed her party to leaving, can she explain how the Labour Party believes it can negotiate anything other than this between now and next March? The Labour Party has no remedy for this, unless you're thinking of reopening the question of our membership of the European Union.
As I said earlier, one of the problems in these negotiations and why they have not gone further is the Prime Minister's reckless red lines, particularly on the question of the ECJ. But let me return to the issue of immigration. And I have to make progress. And let me first deal with the status of EU nationals. I will begin by saying how distasteful it was to many of us that the Prime Minister referred to queue jumpers. She seemed to be implying that there was some unfairness or illegitimacy in their role in British society, whereas EU nationals play a vital role in business, academia, agriculture and public services like health and social care. But EU citizens and dependents living here cannot be reassured by the terms of this deal. The Home Secretary has given general assurances, but the deal says almost nothing in detail about their rights, including work, residency and access to services. And there can be no one on either side of this House who has ever had anything to do with the Immigration Nationality Department who can have confidence in the Home Office's ability to process the approximately 5 million applications that are required to process settled status applicants. I'm aware the Home Secretary sets great store by his app, but he knows perfectly well that app cannot be used on iPhones, and although it has been trialled, those persons were volunteers and the simpler cases. We have all seen the shameful chaos around the Windrush scandal. Today's National Audit Office report on Windrush is comprehensively negative. It criticises the Home Office for poor quality data, risky use of deportation targets, poor value for money and failure to respond to numerous warnings that the policies would hurt people living in the UK legally. It is a damning report and ministers should be ashamed. EU citizens can only await with trepidation their further and deeper engagement with the Home Office. And then...
She and I represent very different constituencies, but they are amongst the poorest in the land. And one of the ironies about the present situation on immigration is that my constituency now has the lowest percentage of people living in it, not born in it, for 120 years. Don't we need to make... And one of the benefits that my constituents have enjoyed in recent years is the ability to go and live, work, study elsewhere. I understand all the arguments about wanting to limit the number of people coming into this country, though I personally find it quite distressing. Should we not make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here? We need to make sure that our citizens have the right to study, work and prosper, whether they come from the poorest background or the richest background in this country.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you for your intervention. And I would say, quite seriously, that if members talk to younger people, one of their biggest sources of doubt about Brexit is they don't welcome the idea that they will not be able to travel and work and study in the way they have done under our current membership of the EU. But then there is the question of the missing immigration white paper. The Home Secretary said that he didn't want to rush to produce it. I have to remind the House that we were originally promised it in the summer of 2017, then the government was going to produce it in February of this year, then it was going to be published in March before the recess, then in July, then after the MAC report in October. Now the current Home Secretary assures us that it will certainly be published, as he puts it, soon. What confidence can anyone have in post-Brexit immigration policies when ministers still seem as if they don't know what they want, or more to the point, can't agree on what they want? And how can this House be expected to vote on this deal without detail on the proposed immigration policy? Yeah, we do know that the Tories are stealing some of our terminology about a rational immigration system based on our economic needs. But I suspect that ministers mean something very different. On this issue, government rhetoric sounding like Labour is a very insincere form of flattery. But the suspicion must be that the government's actual policies are to begin to treat EU migrants as badly as they've treated non-EU migrants over many years.
I thank my honourable friend. There's one other factor which she may be coming on to. Would my honourable friend agree that it would be quite possible for the government to apply freedom of movement in a more restrictive way, particularly regarding the world of work, as other countries such as France have done? And would she like to speculate on perhaps one reason why the government hasn't done that is because the Home Office is so overwhelmed and has been so much cut that actually it wouldn't have the capacity to enforce such a tighter policy?
Absolutely. There's no question that the cuts have had an impact on the Home Office, and I welcome my friend's intervention. The government has also suggested that they will distinguish between high-skilled and low-skilled migrants and discriminate in favour of high-skilled migrants. On the face of it, that's a logical position. Yet all the indications are that their real distinction is between high and low-paid migrant workers, and that will leave a range of sectors struggling with skills and labour shortages, including nurses, social care workers, agriculture workers and others in the private sector. This artificial distinction between high and low-skilled migrants, which is really about income, is both unfair and potentially damaging to the economy. The government has repeatedly promised a new immigration bill for a post-Brexit environment. As I've said, it's been promising it for a very long time. But it might seem to be the case that there is a split in the government. I know it sounds shocking, but there's a split in the government between adjusting the immigration system towards supporting our economic needs versus their constant campaign against migrants and migration. They'll probably try and do both. cake-and-eat-it politics. There's also no indication that the government will drop its unworkable net migration target, which has never once been met, but allows a continuing negative narrative against migration and migrants. The level of non-EU migration alone is currently running close to 250,000 people a year, and that is the migration over which the government has absolute control. And there's no indication that the government intends to end the hostile environment policy. Rename it, yes, but end it, no. And yet we know that the hostile environment policy led directly to the Windrush scandal. The spurious distinction between high and low skilled, which is really discrimination against the lower paid, will have negative consequences for a range of sectors. We await with interest the publication of the immigration bill to see how internal differences within the government have been resolved. But the government is asking all of us to vote for its deal without telling us what its new immigration policy will be. This is a blindfold Brexit deal. We on this side of the House, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, we honour and we respect the referendum vote. But how can it be that ministers are asking the House to vote for a deal which neither Leavers or Remainers are happy with, asking us to vote for a deal when so many crucial issues, notably security, are not yet clear, asking us to vote for a deal which could endanger not just our economy but our security going forward? The more you examine this deal, the more it becomes clear that this House cannot vote to support it.
Sam Gyimah.
Mr. Speaker, it is with a sense of trepidation that I stand to speak from the backbenches for the first time in 6 years and the first time since my resignation last Friday in order to vote against this withdrawal agreement. Mr. Speaker, I loved my job. Innovation, scientific endeavour represent the best, and our universities represent the best of Britain. They underpin our future, and they also underpin our place in the world. So I did not take the decision lightly. And at this point, I'd like to say congratulations and good luck to my successor, the Honourable Member for Kingswood, and wish him all the best in that job. But as I considered the deal in front of us very carefully, Mr. Speaker, the deal that has been described as having a Remain flavour, even as a Remainer, it became quite clear to me that this deal is not politically or practically deliverable, that it will make us poorer and it would also risk the Union. So, as I look at it, and I encourage everyone to, I'm sure everyone in this House will come to their own decision, I considered that before we are all Leavers and Remainers, we are British. And it is the national interest that we care most about. But what is in front of us in terms of the political declaration is not a deal. It is a deal in name only.
Right.
What we have is a framework for negotiation with a lot of aspirations. Right. And yes, it has all been hard fought for and hard won, and I give the Prime Minister and her team the credit for that. But now that it is in front of us in Parliament, we have to look at this as parliamentarians. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, admitted on the front bench that it might not be perfect, almost implying that this was like trying on a pair of shoes that were not the right colour and maybe a little bit tight, but you could get on with it and life would be fine. But actually, these are like shoes that have got holes in the soles. This deal is fatally flawed. And there are three big reasons for this. The first is that all the big issues, whether on security, on home affairs, on agriculture, on fishing, on our independent trading policy, on frictionless trade, have been kicked into the long grass.
That's not true.
So while the public is being told that this is almost like the end of a process, we are actually just finishing one process and about to begin on another long and arduous process. But we will be doing that at a time when we have given up our vote, our veto, and our voice, and would have no leverage whatsoever. The ultimate fallback position in this deal is the Northern Ireland backstop. But so we will be negotiating with a clock against us, with a fallback position that is existential for us, not existential for the EU, and we will be expected to get the best deal for Britain. I doubt that very much. So I believe that in voting for this deal, we will be losing and not taking control of our destiny. So we have to be clear-eyed going into these negotiations. The negotiations have been set up for failure. The EU will manage the timetable, they will manage the sequencing of the negotiation, they will set the hurdles, and they will tell us when we can progress to the next stage. That is what happened in the first phase of the negotiations. That's what will happen in the second phase of the negotiation. We will always be in a position where we have to walk away or fold. And I know what will happen. We will always fold because we will have the clock ticking. The EU elections next year would pose, let me give an illustration, a big problem for us. Because everyone in the EU in 2019 will be focused on their elections. So the first year of our initial two-year implementation period, I doubt much progress will be made. And at the end of that year, there will be a new commission, there will be a new parliament, who were not party to the political declaration that we are going to be voting on in this House. A new trade commissioner will then be appointed. We will then have 1 year as part of the first implementation period to negotiate or go for an extension. In all likelihood, we will go for the extension in June, July that year. So we will trip into the second implementation period and we will pay over a significant amount of money for that privilege. And what that means is we will then get into the second with a general election in the horizon. A Northern Ireland backstop no one in this House wants. And yes, whatever assurances we are given, it is in all likelihood that we will pay any price the EU asks of us in order to get out of that backstop. So what do we have? Mr. Speaker, we have best endeavours to rely on. Now, my job as a previous Science and Innovation Minister, I was involved in the Galileo negotiations. And what I realised there, what happened, is that the EU stacked the deck against us time and time again. Before the ink was dried on the transition deal, we were served notice that we could not participate in the security aspects of it, even though when we were negotiating the transition deal, we had been led to believe that we could. We were then served notice that British industrial interests could not bid for contracts, even though it is British companies that had built the encryption and the security elements of Galileo. They could do it, but they had to move within the EU in order to do so. We threatened to use our veto. The date of the vote was moved, and in the interregnum, they changed the rules so that our veto didn't apply because the rule became simple as majority voting. Galileo, Mr. Speaker, is a foretaste of what is to come in these negotiations. So we are setting ourselves for failure. I'll make some progress and take that intervention. We're setting ourselves for failure by going down this route. I'll take the Galileo intervention in that case.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. But he must appreciate that the concerns about Galileo were raised as long ago as the summer of 2016. Yeah. So it's simply not the case that the issues, the potential
problems in terms of accessing Galileo were not known during the negotiations. Yeah. That's not the case. There were many articles written about it, and many industry representatives raised their concerns with us over this.
The concerns were raised, they were discussed. We signed a transition deal on the basis of best endeavours, only to realise that that was not the case, the basis on which the other side was operating. But I do not begrudge the EU for putting the EU first. I do not begrudge the EU for aggressively prosecuting its interests. What I do have a concern with is that, given the political declaration we have in front of us, we do not have much leverage at all. And so that unique relationship that we're being told we can negotiate is unlikely to happen. What is most likely to happen is that we will be given an FTA dictated to us by the EU. So, Mr. Speaker, we should level with the public. This deal doesn't bring closure. It's not signed here and let's have a compromise and all the discord and disharmony we've had over the last 2 years will suddenly disappear. We will have Brexit secretaries resigning next year because a lot of the issues have still not been trashed out. It will not heal the divisions that we see in our country. We are at the foot because ultimately we are at the foothills of a long and arduous process. Brexit will not be over as a result of this vote next week. And finally, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, said, there is no alternative. I believe that is a false choice. There are many options. What we have is a deal that has been engineered to put maximum pressure on all the other options in favour of the option that the government is putting in front of us. Now, we could list what some of those options are, and I'll list them without prejudice of saying which, without prejudice initially. Firstly, we've got the government's deal. Secondly, there is revocation of Article 50. Thirdly, there is a no deal. The important thing about these three things is all of those are within our control and do not require negotiation with the EU. If we want to negotiate with the EU, we can negotiate to extend Article 50 in order to look at the backstop again. We could negotiate with the EU to extend Article 50 to have another referendum. We can negotiate with the EU to extend Article 50 to look at the Norway option, which a number of colleagues I know are interested in. Mr. Speaker, the government might box itself in with its own red lines. There is no reason why this Parliament has to accept to be boxed in by those same red lines. Now, but there is a constraint, Mr. Speaker, and the ultimate constraint to me seems to be that there is no majority for any option in this Parliament. That yes, there might be lots of options, but I doubt there will be a majority for them. So what I have said is that we should not rule out, if need be, going back to the people. And when I say that, everyone says it will be corrosive of our politics, it will be destructive of our politics, and it will be hugely divisive. Now, we shouldn't be presumptive about where the electorate is. But I believe that is not a reason to vote for this withdrawal agreement. Because voting for this withdrawal agreement, giving the public the impression that this is the best compromise and there are no problems further down the line, this is Brexit done. When they wake up and see that Britain is being hobbled and crippled in those negotiations, that would also disappoint voters, and that would also be corrosive of our politics. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I resigned because I thought this is the biggest vote I'll probably ever vote in my political career. It is for each member in this House to decide what they do. But for me, the national interest is not served by voting for the government's motion.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for East Surrey, and I applaud his courage in resigning as a result of his concerns about the deal. Mr. Speaker, there's much I could say about the detail of this agreement. Red lines breached, for example, in the Court of Justice of the European Union, Articles 87, 89, 158 and 174 and Article 14 of the Protocol in relation to Northern Ireland to make it very clear that the Prime Minister has had to make some pretty major concessions on her red line on the Court of Justice. We heard in the Chamber, and we've now seen it in writing clearly in the legal advice, that on the Northern Ireland backstop, as a matter of law, we could be trapped in the backstop permanently and unable to get out of it, as I sought to clarify with the Attorney-General earlier this week. And we've also seen that in relation to the Northern Ireland backstop, the catch of fishing vessels registered in Northern Ireland will have preferential treatment in having tariff-free access to the market in a way that fishing vessels registered elsewhere in the United Kingdom, including Scotland, will not have. And I very much look forward, but not hold my breath, to hear the Scottish Conservatives making a fuss about that. I think today, Mr Speaker, is really, and the next few days should really be about the bigger picture. I'm really looking forward to having an in-depth debate about immigration in due course, if we ever do see that much promised white paper. But I do want to just say a few remarks about it just now, before I move on to the bigger picture. As I said earlier, it is a matter of record, because Scotland voted to remain, that the Scots did not hold the same concerns about sovereignty or immigration as have been held elsewhere in these islands. Yet the political declaration confirms the UK Government's intention to end freedom of movement. And that will see people across these islands, but in particular the Scots who didn't vote for it, lose the rights they have as EU citizens. It's a deal which will see us made poorer, not just economically, but also equally importantly, socially. Even the MAC have acknowledged that inward migration has made an overwhelmingly positive contribution to the economy of these islands, and particularly Scotland. In fact, the MAC, whilst failing to acknowledge the need for regional and national variations in immigration policy across the UK, it did knock on the head many of the myths about immigration which drove the sort of xenophobia which led to the poster that the Right Honourable member, the Labour Party spokesperson, described earlier. So, Scotland in particular, Mr Speaker, has benefited from inward migration because at the start of this century we had a dwindling population. And that EU migration has built our population and has brought many young and economically active people into Scotland. And it is a fact, and any Scottish MP who holds surgeries regularly will tell you, it is a fact, and I have two major universities in my constituency and all the academics tell me, it is a fact that the process of Brexit and the rhetoric around immigration in this country is discouraging people from coming to live and work and study in Scotland. The Scots didn't vote for that. And that's one of the many reasons why we won't be supporting this deal. Freedom of movement has been something that has been vital to fill gaps in the employment market in Scotland and indeed across the United Kingdom. We've got a big crisis across the UK in how we look after our ageing population. A lot of the people who look after our ageing population at present come from elsewhere in the European Union, and it will be a real shame if we discourage them from coming here in the future. But let's look... Yes, I'll give way.
I'm interested by what she's saying, and I'm somebody who agrees with her, really, on students coming to the United Kingdom and should be able to work for a period as part of the payback. I think that is important. But doesn't she accept the fact that there are many people who voted Brexit who are not saying no to immigration, it's just controlling immigration, and it's that this Parliament or the government of this country should be the one that decides immigration levels?
Well, nobody's saying that we shouldn't have an immigration policy. Of course we have to have an immigration policy. The point I'm making is that the immigration policy should be evidence-based and should take account of the needs of the economy and the different regions and nations of these islands, and this government's policy does not. If this government has such a great idea about the future policy on immigration across the UK, why is it taking them so long to bring forward the White Paper. And if they're so keen to throw their arms open to people from all across the world and have everyone come here on an equal basis, why does the Prime Minister, your Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of these benches opposite, persist in her ridiculous net migration target? It's just nonsense that the benches opposite want to throw the doors open. For so long as the Prime Minister is in place and that ridiculous migration target's in place, that simply won't be happening. I'll give way to...
Very grateful to my honourable learned friend for giving way. Isn't the reality, though, that the government will try as much to ramp up the rhetoric around about EU migrants, but the reality is to try and get some of their trade deals through, they're going to have to bend the rules when it comes to visas for India and the likes anyway. So what they're taking with one hand, they're giving with the other anyway.
I entirely agree with my honourable friend. It is crystal clear that countries outside the European Union, if we ever get to the stage of being able to enter into third-party trade deals, and that looks pretty unlikely at the moment, but if we ever get to that stage, in return for access to their markets, they are going to want access to the UK for people who want to migrate from their country here. And I want to just touch briefly on the position of EU citizens. Yes, I will, of course.
I'm thankful for giving way. Will she agree with me that it is the language around immigration that has been so incredibly toxic? And that, like people like me, I'm a European migrant, and I look around and think, do they mean me? And that is exactly what other Europeans feel as well.
Yes, I do agree with the Honourable Lady, and I think part of the reason the language has been so toxic is we haven't been talking about the reality of the situation, we've been talking about a perceived reality. And something that a Labour member, an honourable member, I think he's not in his place any longer, a point he made earlier, I think, which I entirely agree with, is that the benches opposite, the government benches, by their policies, have created a great deal of poverty across the United Kingdom. Wales and Scotland have, to an extent, been protected from that because we have had different devolved governments. I notice as I travel around provincial England that the infrastructure is not in such a good condition as it is in Scotland. No social housing has been built here for years. In contrast, we're building a lot of social housing in Scotland. I think many working class people in England have been led to believe that the cause of their woes, the fact they can't get a house, the fact they can't get a well-paid job, OK, they can get a job but not a properly paid job, they've been led to believe that that's the fault of the immigrants when it's the fault of this toxic Conservative government. Now, under the withdrawal agreement, EU citizens who are already here will not continue to enjoy the same rights that they do at present. I know they'll continue to enjoy some rights, but it won't be the same rights. They'll lose their lifelong right of return. They won't have the same family reunification rights. And they'll get no protection from inadvertently becoming undocumented illegal citizens. And my goodness, Mr. Speaker, the Windrush scandal has taught us what happens to undocumented citizens, lawful citizens in this country. God help EU citizens who find themselves undocumented. Illegal citizens. Don't take my word for it, take the word of the National Audit Office and reports of various committees in this House. And in order to hang on to the rights they already have, not to get a passport, but to get the digital identity that means they can hang on to the rights they already have, EU citizens are going to have fees imposed upon them. Now, in Scotland, the Scottish Government has said that they will pay those fees for those working in the public sector. And now it looks like there might be a bit of a tax catch in relation to that, and I'm looking forward to the Conservative Government addressing that properly and perhaps extending the same largesse as the Scottish Government has to people working in the public sector at the south of the border. I'm going to touch briefly on the security, justice and law enforcement issues, because I think it's been said very clearly by others. It is simply impossible for us as a third country to have the same degree of security, justice and law cooperation as we previously had. And I think, in fairness, the Home Secretary recognised that. But one of the things that's concerned those of us who represent Scottish constituencies, some of us at least, and the Scottish Government and commentators in Scotland most about this process has been the abject failure of the British Government to recognise that Scotland has a separate civil and criminal justice system. Now, this isn't about devolution. This is about the Act of Union. Scotland has had a separate legal system forever and it's protected by the Act of Union. Yet our separate criminal justice system, our separate civil law system, our separate law officers have not been consulted properly. in relation to the impact of these matters on the Scottish legal system. And of course, as we know, there is no mention whatsoever of Scotland in the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration. A lot of other much smaller regions get a mention, but not Scotland. And this isn't just fanciful, Mr Speaker. I know, because I used to work in the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, that cooperation across Europe has made a huge difference to law enforcement in Scotland, and that if we lose that, we will be the worse as a result of it. But as I said, Mr Speaker, earlier, I think today is really a day for the bigger picture. And I see the bigger picture as somebody who represents a Scottish constituency and somebody of Irish parentage. I see the bigger picture of the whole Brexit process really as a tale of two unions. The union that is the United Kingdom and the union that is the European Union, and the extremely stark differences as to how the members of those unions treat each other. So far as Ireland is concerned, both North and South, British politicians largely overlooked the threat that Brexit posed to the Good Friday Agreement until after the referendum. And even then, many, particularly on the benches opposite, were unable to accept, and still are unable to accept, the reality of the legal obligations which the United Kingdom undertook in the Good Friday Agreement. Yeah. And that old anti-Irish xenophobia, which people like my mother remember so well, has raised its head again, even to the extent of some on the benches opposite talking about the Irish tail wagging the British dog and other such insulting metaphors. But because the EU27 got behind the Irish government's legitimate concerns, they became central to the Brexit process. Politicians on the benches opposite, not all of them, but some of them, and indeed a few behind me, waited in vain for the EU27 to crack and throw Ireland under the bus. It didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. No. I was at an event recently where the very distinguished Professor of Modern History at UCD, Mary Daly, remarked that the current situation in this House has very uncanny echoes of what happened here 100 years ago, when the electric politics of Ulster determined what happened at Westminster. And it's really quite ironic that that should be so, Mr Speaker, as we're shortly to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the election of the first female MP to this Parliament, who was, of course, a distinguished Irish nationalist, the Countess Markievicz, who went on to be the first woman Cabinet Minister in Western Europe. But the truth is, the problems that arose as a result of partition have come back to haunt this House as a result of the Brexit process. I think something that unites us all is we want to see peace kept in Northern Ireland. And yes, I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Would she accept that the Republic of Ireland actually has been thrown under the bus and don't even realise that the wheels are running over them at present? Because if this agreement goes through, a border down the Irish Sea will not only affect Northern Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland, whose main market is GB, who takes its goods across the GB as a land bridge and will find checks not just at Holyhead but at Dover.
Well, no, I don't accept that, and I speak regularly with politicians from all parties in the Republic of Ireland, and certainly that's not how they see matters. And in fact, politicians and indeed business and the wider community in the Republic of Ireland are broadly very, very happy with the way that the European Union has dealt with this. And of course, Mr Speaker, it's sometimes conveniently forgot in this House that Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union, and that's partly because during this time, Northern Ireland hasn't had the democratic voice of its assembly. So it's only the voices of the honourable gentleman that has been heard in relation to Northern Ireland. And of course, the honourable gentleman's party, the DUP, do not represent the majority of people in Northern Ireland who voted to remain. And the Prime Minister has refused to meet with the Greens, the SDLP, Sinn Féin or the Alliance, which I think is really quite disgraceful. Anyway, Mr Speaker, meanwhile in Scotland voted to remain in the EU by an even more substantial margin than Northern Ireland, 62%. And polls show if a vote was held tomorrow, it would be nearer 70%. Despite that, the Scottish Government's concerns, and it's a democratically elected government, I know benches opposite like to call it the SNP government and pretend it doesn't have any legitimacy, but it was elected democratically. Its concerns, often supported by other parties in the Scottish Parliament, as it will be today, when Liberal Democrats, Greens and Labour will vote with the SNP in trying to protect Scotland from the consequences of Brexit, the legitimate concerns of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have been wholly ignored, and we can really only look with envy whilst the concerns of the Irish Government have been centre stage. in Brussels. And unlike Northern Ireland, Mr Speaker, Scotland has actually had a strong and functioning government and parliament during this process, well able to express its views, but that hasn't protected us. And so this Brexit process has highlighted the limits of devolved as opposed to independent government. I
thank honourable friends for giving way, and she's absolutely right. We fully expect the Scottish Parliament this evening to endorse a cross-party motion rejecting the withdrawal agreement, just as the Welsh Assembly did last night. The Scottish Conservatives are describing that debate as needless. Scotland doesn't need to talk about Brexit. Westminster, the big Parliament, will make that decision for you. Know your place. That exemplifies how they want to undermine devolution and use Brexit to do so.
Of course, the Scottish Conservatives don't represent the majority of Scottish opinion in relation to anything, let alone Brexit. It's often forgotten, after all the hullabaloo about the seats they won last year, that they are still very much in the minority in Scottish politics and very much in the minority in the Scottish Parliament. But let's just look at what has happened in relation to Scotland over the last 2 years. The UK Government cut the Scottish Government out of the Brexit negotiations completely. The Scottish Government put forward a differentiated deal, the idea of a differentiated deal or the idea of a compromise for the whole of the United Kingdom at an early stage. That was completely ignored. The Scottish Parliament voted, again with cross-party support, everyone apart from the Tories and one Lib Dem, voted to withhold consent to the EU withdrawal bill. That was ignored. When the Scottish Parliament tried to pass its own legal continuity bill, it was challenged in the UK Supreme Court, and we're still waiting for that decision, challenged by the British Government. And when amendments came back from the House of Lords to the floor of this House in relation to the withdrawal bill, Scottish MPs got 19 minutes to debate the implications of those amendments, and the full time was taken up by the Government Minister. Scotland isn't mentioned in the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration, and whilst little Gibraltar, important as it is, was afforded advance sight of the agreement, the Scottish Government only saw it when the rest of us did. So what the point I'm making, Mr Speaker, is Scotland's marginalisation and its very weak bargaining position within the union that is the United Kingdom has been very exposed by Brexit. After our failure in the independence referendum of 2014, 56 Scottish National Party MPs were elected to this House, yet not one of our amendments to the Scotland Bill at that time got passed, despite the fact we had 56 out of the 59 seats in Scotland and 50% of the vote at that time. Not one. But yet we were told this wonderful Scotland Act was going to give us huge amounts of powers, and we had the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. Well, I ask any fair-minded person in this chamber or anyone watching, does the sequence of events that I've just described really sound like the most powerful devolved parliament in the world to you? Of course it doesn't, because devolution's constitutional fragility has been revealed in Westminster's assertion of control and the attempt to repatriate powers here from Brussels, and also the disregard shown for Scotland's preferences in the negotiations with Brussels. So, Mr Speaker, the Brexit process has told Scottish voters a lot about the reality of devolution, and that power devolved is indeed power retained, and that the United Kingdom is not the union of equals we were told it was before 2014, but a unitary state where devolved power is retrieved to the centre when convenient, and no one but the Conservative Party, who only represent a minority of voters in Scotland, get a say on major decisions over trade and foreign policy. So, Mr Speaker, the experience of Ireland and Scotland during the Brexit process show us there's a very significant contrast between the way that the nations who are member states of the European Union are treated and the nations who are members of this union are treated. And I heard the very distinguished former Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, John Bruton, speak recently, and he was asked about this, not by me but by somebody else in the audience. And he said Scotland's marginalisation within the United Kingdom wouldn't happen in the European Union. If the European Union was taking a decision as drastic as Brexit, and it only had 4 nations in it, then all 4 nations would have needed to have agreed. But in the UK, it doesn't matter what Scotland and Northern Ireland say. They can always be overridden by the English vote. And that is not an anti-English comment, it is a comment on the constitution of the United Kingdom. If Scotland was a member state in the EU, albeit a country of only 5.5 million, we would have, just like Ireland, the same veto over such a major decision, in the same way that the big countries have. Now, Mr Speaker, there is still a little bit of hope for Scotland, and it comes from the cross-party working that we've seen in Scotland, both in the Scottish Parliament today and in the group of politicians of which I'm proud to have been a member, who took the case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, where we found out yesterday the Advocate-General says Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked. And I was interested to hear the Prime Minister, in response to my question earlier today, acknowledge that it's highly likely that the Grand Chamber of the Court will follow the Advocate-General's opinion. So it seems that Scotland and Scottish politicians and the Scottish courts are throwing this Parliament a lifeline to get out of the madness of Brexit. But even if we do throw that lifeline, and even if the United Kingdom Parliament takes it, and even if there is a second referendum, and even if the whole of the UK is smart enough in possession of the full facts to vote to remain part of the European Union, don't think that will be the Scottish question closed, because the Brexit process has wholly revealed our inferior status within this union, and people will not forget that. Exactly. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm just coming to a conclusion. The last 2 years have shown us that the Leave vote was won across the United Kingdom on the back of promises that have proved undeliverable. Now, many people say that those promises were lies, but whether they were lies or not, what we do know is that they've proved undeliverable. Now, it's hard for me to be fair to the Prime Minister because of the scorn she has shown for Scottish democracy, but I'm going to try to be fair to her, and I'm going to say this. I don't think this is a bad deal because the Prime Minister is a bad negotiator. The truth is, there is no better deal than the one the United Kingdom currently enjoys within the European Union. The Prime Minister at least tried to negotiate a deal. Others who led the Leave movement have totally and utterly abdicated their responsibility. And I watched with interest yesterday while the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip attempted or struggled to explain what it is that he wants. I was none the wiser by the end of his speech. And let's not forget his partner in crime in the Leave movement, who has left his place on the Treasury bench now, but the member for Surrey Heath, yes. Why didn't he take the job of Brexit Secretary when it was offered to him a couple of weeks ago? Why, if you desire something so much, why not take the responsibility of delivering it? I think we all know the answer to that question. And then, of course, there's the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden. His insouciant appearances at the Brexit Select Committee were really highly entertaining, but also deeply shocking. And now, where is he? I don't see him much in the chamber in the last few days, but he's certainly not proposing any firm alternative to this deal. So, Mr Speaker, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the much maligned Court of Justice of the European Union, with the assistance of Scottish parliamentarians and the Scottish courts, has opened up new vistas of possibility for this chamber. There is a chance of reversing the madness, but I accept that there will need to be a second vote. In order to do that, we'll have to work cross-party in this chamber. There's a lot of that going on already, but may I respectfully suggest that parliamentarians in this chamber look north to what's happening in Edinburgh this afternoon and see that it's possible. It's possible at least for the SNP, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Greens to work together. And we know from this House that it's also possible for the parties I've just mentioned to work together with some members on the benches opposite. But I want to make something crystal clear, Mr Speaker. Make no mistake, if there is a second vote across the UK, and if England, in possession of the full facts and the reality of Brexit, votes again to leave, and I'm quite sure Scotland will vote to remain, then Scotland won't stand for that, and there will have to be a second independence referendum. And this time we know that we will have a far more sympathetic ear in Europe than we had before. Why, even the Spanish, supposedly Scotland's great enemies, their foreign minister said recently that if Scotland secedes from the UK constitutionally, he will not veto Scotland's membership of the European Union. And as I said yesterday, I very much hope that when an independent Scotland comes to try and seek membership of the European Union, it will be remembered that it was Scottish parliamentarians and the Scottish courts who attempted to give the UK Parliament an escape route from Brexit. But even if the United Kingdom does take that lifeline and that escape route, I think it's quite clear that this Brexit process has shown that the United Kingdom in its present form is not a union in which Scotland can continue to function properly. We have seen, now I'm coming to my end, we've seen written large during this process the difference between what it means to be a member of the United Kingdom and a member of the European Union. In the European Union, even small countries like Ireland are equal partners with big countries like Germany and France. In the United Kingdom, a small country like Scotland is not an equal partner with England. The power devolved as the power retained, and Scottish democracy is always at the whim of the majority in this House. It's not tolerable, Mr Speaker, and despite what happens with Brexit, which I very much hope is reversed for the whole of the United Kingdom, I hope that the Scots will soon take the opportunity to say that Scotland's position in the UK Union is not tolerable, and we want to take our seat at the top table in Europe, in the European Union, where I very much hope we will eventually be an equal partner with England, because I hope England stays too. Thank you.
Thank you. Order. On account of the level of interest, an 8-minute limit on each backbench speech will now apply. Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I should start off by saying that I've always been a pragmatist on Europe and our membership of the EU. And so, from my perspective and my community, we wanted to see a practical way forward found following the referendum. But the deal that we're being asked to vote on, the Prime Minister's negotiated deal, whilst well-intentioned, is not a practical way forward for Britain. It means rules without say. Instead of taking back control, it gives away control. We'll have less say than now over the rules that shape our lives. Worse, not being around the table on setting rules that strategically in the future will matter to Britain. Rules that might disadvantage the city if designed the wrong way. Rules that might disadvantage British industry if designed the wrong way. We aren't taking back control, we are giving it away. And this sovereignty giveaway alone, from my perspective, is already making this deal unacceptable for Britain. And in fact, I find it impossible to see any future Parliament ever updating fresh rules set at the EU level, which we then have to commit to whether we like them or not. So this deal, in the end, will be shown to be inoperable. And the time that that's most likely to happen in Britain will be the time when we have a government with a low or even no majority, such as we have now. So this fragile and unstable withdrawal agreement and political agreement declaration will double up political instability and translate it then into economic instability too, making things worse. So the PM's deal is inoperable. I might welcome the government's assurances on EU workers. Many are in my own local community, but in practice this detail is only limited to the very short term, and my constituents, my businesses who come to my MP surgery want more than that. They want to know what happens beyond the so-called transition period. As others have said, it's disappointing that the government hasn't yet set out its immigration plans for the House to take in context for today's debate and next week's vote. This really matters to a very mixed community that I represent. They need clarity. On the Union, on Northern Ireland in particular, I'm greatly concerned about the undermining of the Good Friday Agreement by this deal and the weak approach by this government on the backstop. I'm concerned about the prospects for the re-emergence of a hard border in Northern Ireland, and that being the more of a challenge, the more we diverge on product standards and regulations. And I'm concerned about prospects for a Northern Ireland that risks being increasingly decoupled from the United Kingdom and how that can undermine the Union at the heart of the United Kingdom. And the economic projections, of course, I'm sure others will talk about this, on our economy, on jobs, are also hugely concerning. The open-ended and uncertain period covered by the withdrawal agreement leaves this country utterly exposed as a rule taker at the very moment we face global economic uncertainty and an increased push for protectionism. And in relation to state aid, for example, During that period, the EU itself can decide if we're breaking the rules, they can decide whether and how much we should be fined, and then they can decide whether we've complied. It will be the judge and jury. That's what we're being asked to support with this withdrawal agreement, and I can't accept this. The timescale it covers, as my honourable friend, the member for East Surrey, has compellingly set out, is hugely likely to be extended. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady. The point she's making about rule-taking and sovereignty is absolutely right. Does she agree with me that the reason we've got into this position is because the whole Brexit debate has defined sovereignty as being purely about immigration and the movement of people and not at all about the rules which govern our economy?
Absolutely.
I think people are certainly much more familiar now about the trade-offs that are involved in relation to Brexit, and I'll come back to that later on. And of course, this thing is called a transition period, it's called an implementation period, but to what? The bottom line is, all we've got on our destination is 26 pages of something called a political agreement. It's not binding, there's no detail, no guarantees, no timescales, and if this was anything else comparable, for example, a big infrastructure project, we'd have a national policy statement. It might be 1,000 pages of detail for the House to consider. Here we've got just 26 pages. A proposed deal on leaving the European Union is perhaps the ultimate national policy statement, yet we've virtually nothing. It's the political equivalent of being asked to jump out of a plane without knowing if your parachute is there and attached. It's like agreeing to move out of your house without knowing where you're going to live next, or not even having agreed the sales price, but selling out and signing the contract anyway. None of us would do this in our own lives, yet this withdrawal agreement and political declaration asks us to do it on behalf of our country. Overwhelmingly, my community does not support it, and I will not therefore be able to back this deal. So there are practical problems, there are sovereignty problems, but I think there are democratic problems too, because this Brexit deal is not the Brexit that Leave campaigners campaigned for, and it is not the Brexit that Leave voters voted for. It is not delivering on the result of the 2016 referendum. Leavers in my own community reject it. I've had hundreds of emails and letters on this. Remainers reject it. They're left thinking, what's the point if Leavers are not happy with the outcome of the referendum where they won? What is the point of leaving to simply have all the same EU rules anyway? And forcing the PM's deal through when it is so universally unpopular will do nothing to heal the divisions in our country. And in fact, it's worse. It's kicking the can down the road, exactly what the public expects politicians to do. It's a short-term political fix at the very time we desperately needed a long-term plan, and people deserve better. That's why they're so frustrated. Brexit has turned into a pantomime. It feels like Groundhog Day, and it is gridlock in Parliament. We have been talking about Brexit now for years, and I think we all need to recognise that government ministers, frontbenchers and MPs will vote, of course, the way that they think is right. And I hope the government does consider a free vote on the government benches, because we do all represent very different communities with very different views. But free vote or no free vote, I believe it's clear that there'll be no majority in this House for any Brexit route forward. Not for the PM's deal, not for Labour's ever opaque deal, whatever that may be, not for no deal, no majority for anything. And yet we've got to bring this to a resolution. We can't keep going round in circles forever. We've got to solve Brexit so that we can get on to solving some of the issues that lie behind Brexit. And this Parliament now needs to take the steps to allow us to get back onto a domestic agenda as the public wants. Now, some on the opposite benches might say, let's have a general election, but that solves nothing, because Brexit is not about party politics. It's why this House has had so many challenges grappling with Brexit-related legislation. So this place is gridlocked. And giving a party political question to people on a question that's not about party politics won't work. And Labour is just putting its own narrow party political interests ahead of the country's vital need to resolve a path forward on Brexit. And I know that the route forward left might be unpalatable to many, including Labour and Conservative frontbenchers, but it may be the only viable route out of Parliament's gridlock. And that's to do what we always end up doing in a democracy, asking the people. And you can do a referendum, Mr. Speaker, in 22 weeks. We could hold it on the 30th of May. It could be a referendum. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She spoke about the importance of healing divisions, and many of my constituents are very concerned that a second referendum would actually make those divisions worse. What does she say to them?
Well, I don't think you heal divisions by pretending they're not there. And I certainly don't think it's democratically justifiable for this government to ram through a version of Brexit that is not what people who voted for Brexit want. That, we have to agree, cannot be acceptable. But if you then combine that with the fact that this House will be gridlocked on all the options, and that's just the practical reality, then we have to find another route forward. I, for one, would argue that a referendum is one of the ways that we could enable millions of Leave voters who don't think that this government's delivering on the verdict of that referendum a chance to have their say properly in a way that they don't think is happening in this Parliament. And we now have some clear-cut, practical choices, and we should put those on the table for people to choose. Those are, I will make some progress given the time. Those are the options on offer for Britain: the Prime Minister's deal, staying on our existing term, or, of course, having a cleaner break, leaving on WTO rules, but then having a free trade agreement after. I think this House should have the confidence to put those clear, practical options that we now face back to the people, and that's why I believe we should have a people's vote. This deal has united people in opposition to it. Nobody gets what they want. That's not compromise. Opposition on all fronts to the Prime Minister's deal isn't a virtue. It's the opposite. It's going in exactly the wrong way, and it will take us back to square one. I believe that we owe future generations, given that this deal is irreversible if we vote it through, we owe them the chance to make sure that this House didn't hope that we were taking the right route forward on Brexit. We knew we were taking the right route forward on Brexit, and that means asking them for their view.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's deal is not really a deal at all. It's a stopgap. And Parliament is being asked today to vote with a massive blindfold around our heads. We know not what our immigration arrangements are going to be because the government hasn't published the white paper. We know not what our trade arrangements are going to be because the political declaration is unclear. And we know not what our security cooperation will be because the declaration is just too vague. And last month, only last month, the Prime Minister told us that nothing was agreed until everything was agreed. But in fact, most things have not been agreed at all. And so what the Prime Minister is doing is asking us to walk out the door, slamming it behind us, without any idea where we are heading or even where we will rest our heads tonight. And I think that is irresponsible, because it's not just blindfold about where we are heading. As the honourable member for East Surrey said in a very thoughtful speech, it also weakens our negotiating hand for sorting out the future and for establishing where it is we're going to be. Chief Executive of Haribo in my constituency said, in response to the transition proposals, he said, 2 years is significant to our supply chain decisions, so this would be very welcome, but the uncertainty would just be delayed. Everything that is an extension of the delay is only useful if it is clear what will happen at the end of it, at the end of the extension, so we can prepare for it. And the problem with this deal, with the political declaration, is, as paragraph 28 admits, there is a whole spectrum of outcomes of checks and controls. Depending on which paragraph you read, you could be on rules of origins checks, you could be on alignment with the common tariff, and you could be as bad as a 7% hit to our national income. So depending on which paragraph it is, this could be nearly Norway, it could be back to Chequers, it could be off to Canada, it could be far beyond. And we simply do not know. On security, things aren't much clearer. The continued access that's promised to the PROM fingerprints database and shared passenger name records is welcome. But the absence of any reference to the crucial SIS2 European criminal database that our border force and police currently check over 500 million times a year is deeply troubling. So too is the absence of any reference to the ECRIS criminal records database. These tools are used to catch criminals, to stop terrorists, to monitor sex offenders, to find dangerous weapons, to stop serious criminals entering the country. And without these measures, the police have been very clear that our country is less safe. And I do not think this House should be voting for things that could make our country less safe. But the government also needs to be clear with us about the impact, because the EU's resistance to committing to allowing us access to SIS2 is frankly reprehensible. But this is their current position, and I fear that this deal weakens our ability to sort this problem out in future and to get that commitment that we need in future that will be in all of our interests. The Home Secretary has said that, well, we didn't have these measures a few years ago, and so therefore this won't cause a huge problem. But the truth is, the security threats, the cross-border criminal threats that we face now are much greater than they were a few years ago. And our police and agencies are running to catch up. So our job here should be to support them in that work, not to make it harder for them to do that, and not to force them to not to hold them back.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she know why SIS2 and ECRIS are not referred to in the Criminal Declaration? Is it because the government didn't ask to try and get them included, or is it that they asked and the EU refused? And if the EU refused, doesn't that reinforce the point that she is making?
Well, my right honourable friend is right, because my understanding is that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary did ask to have these measures included because they understand quite how important they are. However, the EU is continuing to resist. I think that is the wrong position for them to take. I think it's an irresponsible position for them to take. However, if we are going to have an ongoing negotiation on this, we should do so from a position of strength and not by weakening our position, as I'm afraid that this deal does. What are we going to say to victims of crime if in the weeks after we lose access to the SIS2 database, the police or the border force fail to stop a dangerous offender who is on the SIS2 database, who other countries know all about, because we wouldn't let the police have that information, and then that offender commits another crime? And perhaps the most troubling thing of all is that there is no security backstop in this deal. Unlike for Northern Ireland, unlike for trade, there is no backstop to continue security cooperation until a future security treaty or overarching treaty is agreed. So if the transition period runs out and we have not got these things agreed, we will lose these vital capabilities. And given how long it takes to negotiate complex arrangements around extradition, given how long it will take to ratify a full treaty, this again is an irresponsible decision for us to take. On immigration, the proposals that we need still to see will affect not just UK citizens, not just EU citizens wanting to live and work here, but also UK citizens wanting to live and work in the EU, and obviously the arrangements for business recruitment as well. And so I think if the Home Office genuinely does have an immigration white paper that is all ready to go, that they are planning to publish later on in December after this vote, and they deny us the chance to see it before this vote, they have to realise what a signal of contempt that would be to Parliament to do this. And if they have this paper, then they should publish it this week, so there is time for members to see it before the vote. But, Mr Speaker, I have also supported Amendment C, which is in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, because that not only opposes the Prime Minister's deal, it also opposes no deal. And I agree with what the Home Secretary said earlier, that there are significant security risks from no deal. There are clearly economic risks. One local factory has told me that the cost of their imports will double in price if we go to WTO prices, and that another has told me that their European company would be under pressure to move production to continental factories instead. But on security, the threats, I think, are even greater, because the police and border force would immediately lose access to crucial information they use to keep us safe, including legal agreements that underpin ongoing investigations, trials, all of which could immediately be put at risk, including things too like the European arrest warrants that we have out on the Skripal suspects that would also fall. So I would say to other honourable members, even if frankly you don't care about stockpiling medicines or lorry parks on Kent motorways or the Bank of England's warning about recessions, I do hope you will take seriously the warnings from the National Crime Agency and also from the National Council for Police Chiefs about the risk that no deal will make us less safe. And I think, too, that this is also a responsibility on the Prime Minister to be ready, if and when this vote goes down, given the strong views that there are against it, to be ready to take the opportunity to go immediately to Brussels and to request an extension of Article 50 so that everyone has time to draw breath. Now, I know that extending this process is painful for all sides and no one wants to be the person calling for it. But I think we have to be honest that this process is going to carry on regardless, and we have to start behaving like grown-ups on this and actually recognise the serious things that we are going to have to do. There is going to need to be time to build consensus around any possible way forward. I think it is possible to do, but I recognise there are hugely different views in this place and also across the country as well. This deal is flawed and also makes us weaker. But we need to take the time to build a consensus on the way forward. Because that, in the end, is why we are here at all. The Prime Minister, I think, has tried to find compromise, but she has done so without reaching out, without trying to build consensus, without trying to consult, without even giving this House the chance to vote on what the objectives of the negotiations might be. And you cannot do something this big, this hard, something with this many long-lasting consequences without building some consensus behind it. That is the task for us now. It is going to be hard, but that is the test of our politics. I believe we are up to it, but we're going to have to prove it.
Immediately after the next speaker, I'm afraid, on account of the level of interest and the fact of interventions taking time, the time limit will have to be reduced to 7 minutes per backbencher. Mr Shapps is the last to have the opportunity of 8. Mr Grant Shapps.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Broadly speaking, I believe in international cooperation, whether that's the United Nations, NATO, or indeed the European Union, because I think a rules-based world makes this a safer world too. But I also recognise